How did the Mormon community in the Mountain West shift from being a swing vote in national elections in the first few decades of the 20th century to becoming reliable Republicans in the second half? The key is the 1950s and the 1960s. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American history who has authored several books on Mormonism, and this is my 6th video in a series on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and American politics. I've done videos on Joseph Smith, the early territorial issue, disputes over polygamy, the origins of the Mormon-Republican divide, and then my most recent video, I talked about J. Reuben Clark and the push for anti-New Deal in the 1930s, laying a foundation for the Mormon swing rightward. But Mormons continued to vote Democrat, continued to support FDR, even voted for Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964 against many LDS leaders' wishes. The real change then came during those 1960s, a fulfillment of trends that had been in place for several decades. So in this video, I want to talk about the 50s and 60s, climaxing in 1968. Which I truly believe is the year, the hinge point that shifts Mormonism toward a not just conservatism, but a particular type of conservatism. And then in my next video next week, the last in the series, I'll talk about the convergence of Mormonism with the religious right. You can't understand Mormon politics in America, and especially their shift rightward in the mid-20th century, without foregrounding anti-communism. Like many Americans in the post-World War II era during the Cold War period, opposing communism and denouncing anything that's associated with communistic principles drives Latter-day Saints to consider new political realities. This is a fulfillment of J. Reuben Clark, who was an LDS First Presidency member, who was at first anti-New Deal, a principle that soon evolves into anti-communism, meaning denouncing federal intervention and big government. This required the rewriting of Mormon history and theology to forget a lot of communal principles, the communalist ideas that many Latter-day Saints were drawn to in American politics. In my previous video, I talked about people like James Moyle and Amy Brown Lyman. There were several significant figures like the LDS presiding Bishop Sylvester Cannon, who also saw FDR's New Deal and the big government, what comes to be known as a liberal consensus, as a fulfillment of Mormon communalistic principles. But the anti-communist message takes heart in the Mormon land and causes them to move away from communalist thinking and instead emphasizing American triumphalism, a principle that then merges with what scholars call Christian libertarianism, a fusing of, on the one hand, right-wing religious thinkers, and on the other, libertarian principles, trying to cut back federal power. And that's where people like Ezra Taft Benson, who I'm going to talk about in a bit, come into play. So many Mormons shift with other middle-class white Americans during the 1950s. But even as they slowly moved more conservative, there is still a question of what type of conservatism they would inhabit. And I want to talk about two particular models, two potential trajectories that Mormon politics could have gone. And in many ways, these trajectories did exist, often simultaneously, in uneasy relation with each other. One is the more pragmatic, moderate type of conservatism in the form of George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan, one of the foremost politicians during the 1960s. He received lots of awards, lots of praise. John F. Kennedy allegedly said that he was most afraid of running against George Romney in 1964. Romney was moderate, he was pragmatic, he supported civil rights, he worked with labor unions, he represented this compassionate conservative model. The other type of trajectory that Mormons could have taken was the Ezra Taft Benson model. Benson was an apostle. He served as the Secretary of Agriculture for President Dwight Eisenhower. He was much more ideological, conspiracist, reactionary, taking a much more radical approach, embracing extreme politics and eschewing the moderation and the compassionate conservatism that he saw as half measures. These two figures are going to exemplify the divergent strains of Mormon conservatism. Both are going to run for president in 1968 on their various platforms, but that's getting ahead of the story. But before I go deeper into the history, I have to do the awkward but necessary pitch for the channel. If you haven't yet, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every Monday, I do these deep dives on historical topics. I'm nearing my 2-month-long series on Mormonism and politics. On Wednesdays, I do connections of the past and the present, showing the relevance of history to contemporary issues, whether it be politics, media, or pop culture. And then on Fridays, I do a So You Want to Know More About X topic, peeling back the curtain so you can better understand how historical work is produced, both now and in the past. And if you want to give back, I encourage you to consider becoming a member of the channel, which comes with some perks like early access to videos, as well as icons next to your name. So when I glance through the comments, I know who I can respond to. Anyways, let's get back to the video. It would be hard to overstate how cataclysmic the 1960s were for traditional political alliances. This was a decade of radical transformation driven by social movements. It also was a hinge point for how the LDS Church related to politics as they slowly moved more and more conservative in reaction to what they felt was taking place in the United States. Now, while I could focus on a number of key themes and events, I'm only going to focus on 4. The first is the civil rights movement. Those like Martin Luther King Jr., who fought for equality before the law for African Americans. A movement that eventually becomes more radical as the decade moves along without enough changes, which leads to people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers pushing for more radical action. These protests and riots in support of racial equality terrified many white moderates across the nation, moving them more conservative. That included in Utah, where the state had its own fair share of protests, as seen in this video. The Latter-day Saint Church itself became the target for many of the civil rights movements due to their racial restriction, seen as racially regressive and therefore a target of the racial rights protests. The LDS Church, especially the leaders and members, therefore grew hesitant about these social changes and became more conservative in turn. Ezra Taft Benson, for instance, denounced the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., as being tools for communism, red pawns in the broader chess game of liberty. The second main theme was the rise of extreme right-wing politics, most notably the John Birch Society. Here you see an advertisement for that society, which was a radical anti-communist movement that believed there was a global cabal to overturn liberty. Now, even those who weren't affiliated with the John Birch Society, that movement represented a radicalization of right-wing politics, seeing politics as a venue for war, where moderation and pragmatism was no longer an option. One of the leading figures of this broader movement was Cleon Skousen, the Latter-day Saint BYU teacher, Salt Lake City police chief, and an influential public speaker. Ezra Taft Benson was also closely aligned with John Birch Society politics. Here he is at a Birch Society dinner with Robert Welch, who was the president of the Birch Society, with the banner "One Nation Under God." These politics offered a Christian nationalist vision that pitted good versus evil that was quite attractive to many Latter-day Saints who listened to voices like Skousen and Benson to move rightward. The third main theme were the disputes following the Vietnam War. Now, many Latter-day Saints, like America writ large, did grow uncomfortable with the government's intervention in Vietnam, especially when more details came out about how the loss of lives and the intervention was not leading to good. And people like LBJ and the Democratic Party were no longer seen as trustworthy. But even more concerning for Latter-day Saints, like many white moderates, was the anti-Vietnam War protests, which seemed to confirm that the nation was spiraling out of control, that society was no longer remaining stable, and that we needed a law and order return back to tradition. This played into long-standing rhetoric from LDS leaders like J. Reuben Clark, saying that the nation had to be put under the thumb of more righteous leaders because the anti-Vietnam War protests showed that there were too many people in the nation causing chaos. It also fed into the John Birch Society type conspiracies that there is too much chaos being sown by Americans. Now, the fourth main theme I want to discuss are the social revolts, a social revolution that commenced in the 1960s, in part in response to all these issues I've been highlighting already. This is the rise of hippie culture, the use of drugs, early feminism, free love. These seem to confirm the fears for Latter-day Saint leaders that the nation was sliding into some type of unchristian and sinful culture, especially at the very moment where the LDS Church is making the nuclear family and traditional values as their key image, and now it is coming into conflict with mainstream society. And the main result from these four impulses, as well as many others, is it led many Latter-day Saint leaders and members to start following the calls rightward to supporting the Republican Party. And that brings us to 1968, the year that America was nearly torn apart. By the way, there's been a recent and really good book that talks about this presidential election as the confluence of all these different cultural trajectories. I strongly recommend it. It's Luke Nichter's The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential of 1968, if you want a good book recommendation. Now, both figures that I mentioned earlier in this video that represented potential trajectories for the LDS faith, George Romney and Ezra Taft Benson, were both candidates in that election. George Romney was supposed to be the forerunner. He was earlier predicted to be the leading Republican light in the nation, especially when his principles of pragmatism and moderation were seen as the best values for American politics. But by 1968, that brand of politics, that type of moderation, was no longer seen in vogue. It was seen as too much compromising. We needed a much more radical strongman approach. Couple that with Romney's unfortunate statements concerning brainwashing in the Vietnam War that got a lot of attention, his candidacy fell apart. Here's a video of him at a photograph of him at one of those press conferences where his early lead dwindled and he was not even a contender by the time primaries came around because moderation was no longer in favor. Benson was never a serious candidate for one of the major parties, but he was drawn into this new extreme right-wing politics. First, the John Birch Society tried to put together their own party on a 1776 ticket in preparation for the bicentennial coming up, where he was going to run with Strom Thurmond, the South Carolina senator known most famously for segregation. That party did not really come to fruition, but George Wallace, the Alabama governor, who was known for declaring segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, he broke off of the Democratic Party in part due to the party's support for civil rights, as well as a response to the other key issues that I had mentioned already in this video, to form his own independent run. And he wanted someone who could represent this new coalition of right-wing cultural conservative issues. And he wanted Ezra Taft Benson. They held a secret meeting at Wallace's governor house in Alabama, and Benson then flew back to Salt Lake City to try to convince David O. McKay, who is the LDS president, to allow him to run for as the vice president on Wallace's ticket. McKay, in the end, says no, which was crushing to Ezra Taft Benson. So he does not make it on the ticket, but that candidacy in many ways reflected where the right-wing politics in America was going. And that tumultuous election of 1968, with the collapsing coalitions that had dominated American politics, pointed to the future. The Southern strategy and Nixon as a strong man of law and order. In many ways, the Mormons followed those same cultural shifts that you could see, especially in the American South, rightward toward embracing that new type of image, which Nixon was able to take advantage of. 1968 marked the start of Republican true dominance in Utah. Utah had voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, the Democrat. They voted for Nixon in 1968, and they have never voted for a Democrat since then. Utah shifted along with the southern states in America to now become a Republican voting bloc. Benson and Skousen now marked the path for Mormon conservatism, a combination of both leadership discourse from people like Benson and Skousen, as well as the demographic shifts in which we saw many previously moderate and swing white voters in the nation now moving toward the Republican Party. That shifted the spectrum of Mormon political discourse, and in many ways was the foundation of the now taken for granted Mormon-Republican alliance. I hope this video made sense. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others so we can broaden the conversation. If I missed anything, let me know in the comments. History has never been more relevant than it is today, which is why I try to present that type of history, even the more difficult conversations on this channel. Please join me for that ride by subscribing if you haven't yet, and consider becoming a member.